So we pick up the story of Good Friday. Actually, this is Good Thursday night, but it's after dark, so it's already Friday in the Jewish reckoning. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 32. We have just come so far as to have had a brief treatment by Mark of the Last Supper and some of the things Jesus said on that occasion. Much more thorough treatment of the same is given in John's Gospel, or at least of some of the things. And actually, interestingly, John's Gospel doesn't actually mention the institution of the Last Supper. Matthew, Mark, and Luke mention the "this is my body, this is my bread" portion. John doesn't mention that portion. John assumes the readers know about that. And so he just talks about after the meal when he washed the disciples' feet, and the discussion that we had goes on. It's the longest of the recorded discourses of Jesus. It was given to the disciples in the upper room. But Mark leaves it out entirely, except that he does mention that Jesus predicted, A, that one of the disciples would betray him, and B, that Peter would deny him. In fact, that all of them would forsake him. That was predicted, and that's part of the contents of the upper room discourse. But the rest of the contents in John, where Jesus told them that he's going away, but he'll come again, and there's the Holy Spirit going to be given to them, and they'll be able to pray in Jesus' name, and so forth. These things that Jesus taught in the upper room discourse are not found in Mark or in Matthew or Luke. And so we have a very brief treatment of that evening here. And now they've left the upper room, and they've gone to a place where Jesus apparently was accustomed to going on certain evenings to pray privately. It says in verse 32, "Then they came to a place which was named Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I pray.' Then he took Peter, James, and John with him, and he began to be troubled and deeply distressed. Then he said to them, 'My soul is exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch,'" which means stay awake. He went a little farther and fell on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Now, he took all of his disciples to the garden, but apparently he left 8 of them. Judas had already separated himself from them. 8 of them he left apparently just within the gate of the garden somewhere. And then he took the other 3, the inner circle of Peter, James, and John, he took further into the garden and commissioned them to stay awake and pray with him. Then he went a little further still, and he prayed. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what you will." Then he came and found the disciples sleeping and said to Peter, "Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit truly is ready, but the flesh is weak." Again he went away and prayed, and he spoke the same words. And when he returned, he found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. Then he came a third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? It is enough. The hour has come. Behold, the Son of Man is being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise up, let us go. See, my betrayer is at hand." Apparently Judas and those accompanying him were now visible. So between the time Jesus entered the garden and the time that Judas came with those who arrested him, Jesus apparently prayed 3 different times. Each time, it would appear, the disciples, Peter, James, and John, all of them fell asleep, though they were told to stay awake. This is really hard to explain. It was only an hour that he asked them to stay awake. Now, I know sometimes it's hard to stay awake for an hour, but all 3 of them? Maybe it was extremely late at night. And it is, by the way, easier to fall asleep when you're praying. Your eyes are already closed, for one thing. But also because I think the devil particularly likes to interfere with prayers, and he makes sleep seem very irresistible at times when you might otherwise be doing something effective for God, like praying. In any case, Jesus told them to pray so that they would not enter into temptation. He didn't ask them to pray for him. His prayers were for him, although, according to John's Gospel, he had spent a whole chapter 17 of John, praying for his disciples before this. Apparently on the way to the garden he prayed for them, that long prayer in John chapter 17, but now he gives this short prayer for himself. It might have been longer. He might have prayed 3 hours. He might have left the disciples and said, watch for an hour with me, and then he went away and prayed for an hour and came back and found they hadn't stayed awake, and so he went and did it again, kept saying, can't you stay awake for an hour? We don't know how long all this took. And somebody said, well, how did the disciples know what Jesus prayed? I mean, his prayers are actually recorded here. How did they know what he prayed? My impression would be that they heard him pray these words before they fell asleep. And not much more. They fell asleep rather quickly. This is the part they heard. How much he may have prayed besides, we have no way of knowing, since no one was there to record it. Although, of course, even if they didn't hear Jesus pray this, he might have reported this story to them and his prayers and so forth at a later date after his resurrection, when he spent 40 days with them. He may have told the story, but it seems more likely that they actually overheard him praying these particular lines. But it would only take about 5 seconds or less to pray those particular lines. If they fell asleep shortly afterwards, they couldn't tell you what he prayed beyond that. But the gist of his prayer was that if it were possible, he would like to not drink the cup. He would rather not face the hour of suffering. And the cup that he was going to drink, no doubt, is to be understood as the cup of the world's sins, and the punishment due for the world's sins was going to come upon his shoulders. You know, there have been men who have been crucified, tortured, lost their lives in various unpleasant ways, who remained somewhat calm and who managed to keep their composure. Whereas Jesus, we're told in one of the Gospels, actually was sweating, as it were, drops of blood in great agony and great distress, which may give the impression that he was, not really able to face death himself with aplomb and with courage. After all, he had earlier said to his disciples, he that loses his life for my sake shall find it. And now he's losing his life, and is he kind of wimping out? That's what it might appear, when in fact there are people, Peter himself, for example, when he was facing crucifixion, required that he be crucified upside down instead. I mean, he had that much determination. When James, the first apostle to be martyred, was martyred, his head was cut off, and the story goes that as he approached the block where his head was to be cut off, he praised the execution. And, in other words, Jesus seemed to have much more turmoil over this than even his disciples later did. But the reason, I think, is this: Jesus wasn't simply facing death. To the Romans, it was just another routine crucifixion. They crucified thousands of people. But to Jesus, it was bearing the sins of the world and the penalty for those sins. Most Christians would say that even included God turning his back upon him, and that was the thing about the punishment that Jesus dreaded most. That he was going to face the abandonment of God, as no man had ever had to face it before, because he was taking on that particular penalty, essentially all the penalties of hell, in a few moments' time or a few hours' time, were going to be brought upon him. There was more to it than just the physical pain and loss of life. He was expecting that. He knew that was coming. He had been predicting it. So here, he is just face to face with, perhaps he's even beginning to have those sins put upon him. We don't know at this time, but it's a hard thing for him. And he wants his disciples to pray specifically for themselves, that they don't enter into temptation. He knew this was going to be hard for him, but it was going to be hard for them too. And he wanted them to get through it with their faith intact. Anyway, once he found them sleeping the third time, he kind of let them sleep, said, "Oh, go ahead. It's okay." And then he said, "Oh, well, now we better get up because Judas is coming." In verse 43 it says, "Immediately while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude, with swords and clubs, came from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. Now his betrayer had given them a signal, saying, 'Whomever I kiss, he is the one. Take him and lead him away safely.'" Now notice it says there was a great multitude with swords and clubs. These would not be, in all likelihood, any of the same multitudes that had viewed Jesus favorably on earlier occasions, the multitudes that he fed, the multitudes that followed his teaching, the common people who received him gladly, and so forth. A multitude might be a few score or a few hundred people, but the people that were this multitude with clubs and swords and so forth, they would have been people sent by the chief priests. They would have been people who were either their servants or at least sympathizers with them, and probably was the same multitude that was crying out for Jesus' crucifixion in the court of Pilate's courthouse. These were not just a sampling of the Jewish population, because the Jewish population as a whole were not, at this point, hostile enough to Jesus to want to come out and arrest him. They were more or less favorable toward him. So Judas had given them a signal. Just so there's no confusion and you don't arrest the wrong person, I will go right up to the guy and give him a kiss on the cheek, which would be a normal greeting that people would give in those days. But Judas knew that the other disciples would be present. And it's interesting that he not only was willing to betray Jesus, but to put his own friends at risk, because he brought a multitude of armed people, knowing that could, if the disciples, Judas probably knew that Peter wouldn't just take this sitting down, knowing Peter's impulsiveness, and knowing that Peter had a sword too. Certainly Judas was putting his own friend Peter in a position of perhaps getting into an armed conflict with an overwhelming enemy of armed people. But then Judas may have resented Peter and James and John. Remember, they were the three who were given more privileges, and maybe Judas resented them and didn't care what happened to them. In any case, he didn't want Peter being the one arrested instead of Jesus, so he would, since not all the crowd there were familiar with Jesus, Judas would identify him unmistakably for them. And so, as soon as he had come, immediately he went up to him and said to him, "Rabbi, Rabbi," and kissed him. Then they laid their hands on Jesus and took him. And one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now we know that was Peter, because John's gospel tells us that. But why does this gospel, which even comes from Peter, Mark is given as Peter's gospel, why does it not mention that Peter was the one? You might think it's Peter trying to protect himself from the embarrassment, but not so. Other embarrassing things Peter said and did are recorded in Mark's gospel. In fact, Mark's gospel tends to include the embarrassing things about Peter and to exclude from its record the positive things that Jesus said about Peter, that other gospels include. If anything, Peter, in telling the story, does not include the things that flatter himself and does include the things that make him look like a fool. But on this occasion, his identity is obscured. Why? There's a possibility, at least, that Peter was still alive at this time. And that if it was on record that he had resisted arrest forcibly from an official arresting group, that there could be charges brought against him even at this late date. I mean, it'd be a written record of his guilt. Whereas John wrote after Peter was dead, in all likelihood, and could tell who it was who had struck the high priest's servant's ear off. Anyway, it's interesting that Peter is not mentioned by name as the one who did this. And so he drew a sword and he struck off the high priest's servant's ear. John knew that man and called him Malchus. Malchus was the high priest's servant. Probably the reason that John knew him, well, there's two possible reasons. One is that John's gospel tells us that John was acquainted with the high priest's family. It's possible that some of John's relatives were Levites and that he had known the high priest family in his earlier life. And he might well have known the high priest's servant Malchus by name. Or, what strikes me as more possible, more likely, is that Malchus became a believer, became part of the church. So by the time that this record was given, John and the other disciples knew him by name. And why wouldn't he become a Christian? Jesus healed his ear. The healing of the ear is not mentioned here, but it is in Luke, I believe it is, if I'm not mistaken. One of the Gospels, I think it's Luke, records that Jesus healed the man's ear. Verse 48, Then Jesus answered and said to them, Have you come out as against a robber, with swords and clubs to take me? I was daily with you in the temple teaching, and you did not take me. But the Scriptures must be fulfilled. Then they all forsook him and fled, just like Jesus said they would. Now a certain young man followed him, having a linen cloth thrown around his naked body. And the young men laid hold of him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked. And that's all we hear about that young man. We discussed this in our introduction to the book of Mark. Perhaps you don't remember. Only Mark's gospel mentions this young man. And it is a strange circumstance that he found himself in the garden in the middle of the night, dressed only in a bedsheet. That wasn't the way people generally went out for walks in public, or, in fact, people usually didn't go out at night at all, but if they did, they probably wouldn't normally just wrap up in a bedsheet and be naked underneath. Probably wear some clothes. But here we have a man who, for reasons that go unexplained, happens to be present with the disciples. He's not one of the disciples. How did he get among them anyway? Jesus had had his upper room discourse and his meal with the 12 disciples, and then they went to Gethsemane. Presumably most people didn't know that Jesus went there. They didn't know the place. How did this other person, not one of the 12, end up there? In the middle of the night. It's not likely he was just a gardener there. The middle of the night is not when you do the gardening in the garden. A caretaker, maybe? Or was it Mark himself? Most Bible scholars assume that it was probably Mark himself, and that his recording of this is his way of saying rather vaguely, very unspecifically, that he also had abandoned Jesus when everyone else did. It's kind of sort of his confession of his caving in the hour of crisis too. Now, why would it be Mark? Well, a scenario can easily be constructed that makes good sense. In fact, better sense than any other scenario that I can imagine. That would make it Mark. We don't know in whose house the upper room was, where Jesus took the Last Supper. But we do know that there was a house in Jerusalem, which shortly after this, in the book of Acts, became a regular prayer place for the church. An upper room, in fact, where they were when the Holy Spirit came upon them. A house which is referred to in Acts chapter 12 as Mark's mother's house was a meeting place for prayer meetings for the early church in Jerusalem. And although the passages do not tie these together with certainty, it is not at all impossible or even unlikely that Mark's mother's house, where there was a prayer meeting in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 2, may have also been the house that had the upper room in Acts, chapter 12, I should say, that it was the same upper room that the disciples were in Acts chapters 1 and 2 on the day of Pentecost. And that could easily be the same upper room where he took Passover meal, Mark's mother's house. Remember, it says, when he described the upper room to the disciples, you'll find a room that's prepared for us. It says, a large room. They had to have a place with a large room for the day of Pentecost because there were 120 people waiting there. The identification is not certain, but it's not unreasonable to think that it may have been Mark's mother's house where the Last Supper was held. Now, Mark would not have been at the meal because he's not one of the 12. He was just a family member. There's a good chance that if the meal and the conversation upstairs went late, that Mark had gone to bed. Was already in bed. undressed and under the sheets. He knew, of course, because his family were friends of Jesus, that, and they probably were discussing it all the time, that there were people wanting to get Jesus, wanting to arrest him. In fact, that he was in their house rather clandestinely because his presence, if it were known, could get the family and him into trouble. And it may be that he was still awake at the time that Jesus and the disciples left the upper room and started going for Gethsemane, and that Mark's curiosity got the better of him, and he didn't want to let them out of his sight. So he didn't take the time to get dressed. He just grabbed the sheet that he was sleeping in and wrapped himself up and followed at a distance until he found that they'd gone to Gethsemane, and therefore he found himself in the garden at the time when the arrest took place, but not prepared for a social event, just wrapped naked in a bed sheet. But that when they grabbed him, they grabbed the sheet rather than him, and he fled away without any clothes on and probably went home again. That would be a scenario that works. It associates the upper room then with Mark's home. And Mark, therefore, would be a man who, though not in the upper room, would have been in the house, probably, at the time when Jesus' disciples left. And that he'd be in a bed sheet would suggest that he'd probably gone to bed already, but then changed his mind and wanted to follow them. That, to me, strikes me as a scenario that answers to all the data. And I don't know of any other scenario that answers even any of it. So that's the thing I think is probably true. Verse 53, then they led Jesus away to the high priest, and with him were assembled all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes. They were expecting Jesus. The chief priests were gathered with the others of their type. These were representatives of the Sanhedrin, the ruling court of Israel. They didn't generally meet at night. As a matter of fact, the laws that have been accepted by the rabbis about protocol for the Sanhedrin forbade them to meet at night. A night meeting of the court was forbidden, probably because it would be a night meeting of the court would be probably a kangaroo court. You know, anything that is a just matter being brought before the court can be handled in daylight hours where everyone can be available to hear and see what's going on. A night gathering of the court usually means a hasty verdict is being sought under cover of darkness and when other people are not around to know about it. So there was actually a rule that the Sanhedrin was never to meet at night, but they broke the rules. They broke a lot of rules in this particular event of finding Jesus guilty. And we find the high priest and the chief priests and the scribes, not all of them, because the Sanhedrin had some sympathizers of Jesus on it, and I don't know if they were invited. They might have been. We know that Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea were members of the Sanhedrin, and they were sympathetic toward Jesus at this time. There may have been others. It's hard to know whether the chief priests had just invited a quorum enough to make a legal gathering of the court and made up of his hand-picked sympathizers, or whether there were some of Jesus' sympathizers there too, and that just couldn't be avoided, but the chief priest counted on the council to go his way anyway. But it says the chief priests and all the council sought testimony. Oh, I'm sorry, we missed one thing. Verse 54. But Peter, following him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and he sat with his servants, with the servants of the high priest, and warmed himself at the fire. And the chief priests and all the council sought testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but found none. That is, they were looking for witnesses who could say they heard Jesus say something or saw Jesus do something that would be deserving of the death penalty. I'm not sure what they hoped to find. They knew he didn't kidnap people, didn't commit adultery, didn't kill. What did they hope they'd find? Well, obviously, blasphemy would be the thing they'd most be expecting. In fact, there had been numerous times in Jesus' ministry, when people had taken up stones to stone him but didn't carry out the execution, but it was because he said things that they regarded to be blasphemous. The only capital crime they could ever hope that a righteous man like Jesus might be found guilty of in their eyes would be blasphemy. And so they'd be looking for witnesses who had heard him say things that were clearly blasphemous. But they couldn't find any witnesses who could say that he'd said blasphemous things. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimonies did not agree. Now, apparently what it means is, as in a modern court of law, the witnesses are not allowed to hear each other's testimony. They have to come in separately and say what they know, or what they say. And so they can't collude, and they can't make sure they say the same things as each other. And so they had various false witnesses willing to come in, probably friends of the chief priest and so forth, willing to lie about Jesus. But they couldn't get them all to say the same thing. They hadn't really worked out yet what their testimony was going to be. And so the court proceedings were breaking down. And some rose up and bore false witness against him, saying, "We heard him say, 'I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands.' But not even then did their testimony agree." So there were some who said sort of that kind of thing, but they got it different. They didn't all hear him right. What did he really say related to that? He told them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." He didn't say he would destroy the temple and build another one. So that was a false witness. They were saying that he was threatening to destroy the temple. He did not threaten that. And therefore, since they were making it up, they didn't all make it up the same way, and the false witnesses couldn't even agree about what he said on that occasion. By the way, I'm not sure that a man saying he would destroy the temple, but never doing it, could be accused of having said something that was worthy of death. They just weren't able to find anything that the testimony would all agree on. And the high priest finally, because the witnesses had broken down, stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, "Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you?" But he kept silent and answered nothing. Again the high priest asked him, saying to him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Now, we have more information in Matthew on this than in Mark. He didn't just say, "Are you the Christ?" He said, "I adjure you in the name of God, are you the Christ?" And to adjure a witness was to put them under oath before God. When a person was adjured to testify to what they knew, it was a crime for them not to testify. Under ordinary circumstances, a person could be silent in court, but when they're put under adjuration, they had to testify. And although it doesn't mention it here in Mark, Matthew does mention the priest said, "I adjure you in the name of God, that you tell me whether you're the Messiah, the Christ, the Son of the living God, the Son of the Blessed." Then Jesus spoke because he was put under oath in the name of his Father, and he honored his Father. And Jesus said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." Now, you will see this. The high priests, the Sanhedrin, they will see this. It's possible he's here referring to the judgment that would come on Jerusalem, and the Sanhedrin would see Jesus vindicated in this manner. It's possible he's talking about his second coming at the end of the world, in which case they'd have to be raised from the dead to see it, because they're dead now. And it's even possible that he doesn't mean it even as literally as of the 70 AD. Remember, Jesus said to Nathanael, "You will see the heavens opened and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Many scholars believe, I think they're probably right, that he didn't mean that Nathanael would actually have such a vision, literally, but that Nathanael's understanding of Christ would come to see him in that light. It would be as if he saw heaven opened, and that Jesus was the one who connected heaven and earth, upon whom the angels of God ascended and descended. More like he's using a figurative reference to a truth, a reality that Nathanael would have revealed to him in time, but not necessarily that you'd see a vision of the heavens open, as Jesus said. Maybe. We don't know that Nathanael ever had a vision like that. He may have, but it's not necessary to interpret Jesus' words that way. He could be saying to Caiaphas, "You're going to see me glorified."